Well, isn't it a good day? Rain yesterday, sun today, and you chose to come and play with us in person. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for being online. Thank you for just being part of the church, our church community. We love, appreciate, honor you. We do want to honor dads this morning. Dads, granddads, dads to be, dads of the heart. And but today's not just going to be about the dads. Ladies, listen up. There's something in it for you too. So don't switch off and think, yep, I wish my husband was here to hear this. Because it's for you too. It's for the very person that you think needs to be preached to. That's for you as well. So I'm going to trust that as we share the word, open the word this morning, you're encouraged and you're refreshed. And as I do speak on a little bit about, I am going to be speaking to fathers and fathering and the stuff associated with that, the responsibilities associated with that. But I want to honor my dad, who's not here today because he's sitting in South Africa. But he had his 90th birthday earlier this year, and he's still going reasonably strong. He's been a man of determination, of perseverance, a man of substance. He's been incredibly generous. He has a very witty, dry sense of humor. And, sometimes I joke with my family and I say I'm the adopted one because I don't really see my character traits certainly not from my dad. And I know that that's not, I don't mean to say that in a dishonoring way, but sometimes we don't see our own traits. We don't see our parents' traits in us, but others see it. And they're quick to point it out, my goodness, you're so much like your dad, or you're so much like your mom. So, but I am deeply grateful for what he's imparted to us as boys, and to me as a now husband. And so I want to just honor him this morning. And then there has been the odd joke that's been made that when those that know my father-in-law, Chris's dad, and they say to Chris, goodness me, you married your dad. So it is fascinating how we're drawn to certain character traits, and then certain character traits just are part of things that it seems like we can't avoid, but they're there. So the genes run deep, and then the responsibilities and the good habits and the bad habits sometimes run deep too. And we need those plucked out or addressed, or we need to nurture them. I heard a funny story as I was preparing for this about I'm not exactly sure, I don't know if it was Canadian or American based, but it doesn't really matter. But there was a family camp, so this particular church arranges family camps in the summer for dads and kids. So sons and daughters are able to go with their dad to a camp. And this one particular year, the theme of the camp was the Father Heart of God. And so the father spoke to the dads, addressed the dads the one night, and his son addressed the kids in a separate forum. So they met separately, and they just spoke about what it means to understand the Father Heart of God. And then when they came together the next morning, whoever was facilitating that particular morning asked the kids, so what did you learn? What have you learned so far? And the little boy's hand went up, and he said, yes, what did you learn? And he said, I need to get this right because I tend to mess it up. But he said, I learned about the heart of the Godfather. And the guy who was facilitating thought, oh, this is awkward. What does he know about the Godfather? It's a very different message in those that have seen the traditional movies about the Godfather. And I think the famous tagline from the Godfather is, it's not personal, it's strictly business. And you know the things associated with that tagline from that movie, right? So yeah, he kind of got the message wrong. He just messed up the words slightly, but it had significant implications for the meaning, for what that meant. The Father Heart of God versus the heart of the Godfather. We're going to get into that in a little while, and I'll circle back to that towards the end. I'm going to do something strange, unusual. Do you understand? Do all of you understand? Because this could go on for a while. Ken Gill, when he preached a little while ago, he made a reference to my preaching. And I think he meant it that of the messages that he heard about community, mine might have been the longest. So I was hoping that I'd give you a short preach this morning, but I fear that my history precedes me, or my I need to be a little careful. So this could take a while. So I might have to make you stand and sit a few times just so that you track with me. So be prepared, but then get prepared to take notes too. Hebrews chapter 11, the last time I preached was sometime back at the end of May, I think it might have been. I actually referred to the scripture, and I want to refer to it again, and I'm going to read it, and then I'll allow you to sit. If you have the New Living Translation accessible, I'm going to be reading out of the New Living Translation, and this is how it goes. In verse 8, it says, "It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep the promise, and so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. A nation with so many people like that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. All these people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, and the people that had been mentioned prior to verse 8, all of these people died, still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they had longed for the country they had come from, they would have gone back. And you'll hear about the implications of that a little later. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he had prepared a city for them. And then it goes on in verse 17, and I've actually highlighted all the way down to verse 21, just about what Abraham did about offering Isaac up, and then the implications of what that meant for Isaac. And then it went on to Jacob and Esau and his brother Esau. That's a really powerful scripture, and we read all of this in Hebrews 11 because we want to rah-rah these guys and these women of faith, because it's called the Hall of Faith. But I want to share a little bit of a different perspective of that with you, so feel free to sit down. Thank you very much for humouring me and for standing. I hope you stretched there a little bit. So yes, I'm going to be talking today on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you want to track with me, you're welcome to open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to read from chapter 12 through to chapter 50. No, we won't. I'll save you that. But I do want to ask you, if you are interested in what I've shared today, that's where you're going to find a lot of the basis of what I speak about. I'm going to assume that many of us here have probably heard those good old Bible stories of Abraham and what Abraham did. Father Abraham had many sons. And then through to Isaac and then through to Jacob. We've heard those stories, but even as Chris and I shared a little bit about and chatted a bit about what I was going to be sharing on this morning, without having read through all the details, I suddenly realized, I'm a little rusty. I know those stories, but actually I don't know how the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fall together. I'm going to piece a few of those together, but I have taken a large portion, in fact everything that I share with you this morning, out of my study Bible. So none of this is new to me. It's been really well configured by somebody else. But it just talks to these three men. And I found it quite appropriate to want to share about that on Father's Day today, because it's a really nice analogy of Abraham, and we're going to see some of the traits that might have been followed through to Isaac and then through to Jacob. And that Hebrews Hall of Faith in chapter 11 makes you realize that God has a lot of grace and a lot of faithfulness, and his plans are way bigger than our flaws and our incompetencies. So, yeah, let's go. I'm going to refer to scriptures. I'm not going to read too many of them, but this comes out of Genesis chapter 12. God appeared to Abraham one day and promised to make his descendants into a great nation. This was Abraham's part of the agreement, and Abraham's part of the agreement was to obey God. So if I read in chapter 12, and this is one that I will just read to contextualize it. Then the Lord told Abraham, "Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. I will cause you to become the father of a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and I will make you a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. All the families of the earth will be blessed through you. I wish I knew exactly how God spoke to Abraham and if it was as verbal and audible as that, because sometimes we need a word like that that's as verbal and as audible as that for us to be able to hold on to and to grasp onto, so that with unwavering knowledge, insight and faith we can say, yes Lord, I will respond and I'll do what you told me to do. But still, this required an option. Either Abraham could respond and go and leave behind so much of what he had, or he could stay and be comfortable with his family where his family had been for many years. But Abraham chose to go, because that was part of the agreement he had with God, was that he needed to be obedient. Through sharp testing and an incident that almost destroyed his family, and this would be referring to Isaac, and Isaac's being sacrificed, Abraham's call to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham still remained faithful to God. I'm going to ask Jessica, not now, Jess, but a little bit later, she's going to put up a few similarities and a bit of a synopsis for you. So if you don't have to frantically take notes, if you want, you can get your camera out and just take photos of what goes up on the screen later. But let me just talk to the heart matter of what this meant for Abraham, and then we'll go on to the other guys too. We all know that there are consequences to any action we take. And what we do can set into motion a series of events that may continue long after we've gone. Unfortunately, when we are making a decision, most of us think only of the immediate consequences. But these are often misleading because those consequences are short-lived. We don't get to see what's going to happen 10 years down the line or a generation down the line because of our decisions. This is not to put a heavy, please, there is going to be hope, but I do want to raise just certain themes that come out of each of these guys' lives. Abraham had a choice to make. His decision was between setting out with his family and with his belongings on a 1,500-mile journey. I actually forgot to do the calculation of what is 1,500 miles into kilometers, but that's pretty close to 2,600 kilometers, I would think, at least. So where does that take you to? If you're interested in if you drew a circle around Calgary, 2,600 kilometers away, you would be sitting well into the west coast somewhere, and you'd be sitting well into the prairies out east and well, maybe not too far north, but you'd have gotten pretty far north, and then border control would have stopped you down in the States anyway. You wouldn't be able to get into the States. So let's just assume you'd only make a few hundred kilometers down south. But 1,500 miles on foot with camels and with your household and all your possessions is a long way to go. But that's what he was called out of. He was called out of his home in the Ur of Chaldeans, and he had to decide between the security of what he already had or the uncertainty of traveling to where God was calling him and directing him to go. All he had to go on was God's promise. It must have been a very audible or a very convincing word. But he had God's promise to guide and bless him. That scripture that I read out of Genesis chapter 12. Abraham could hardly have been expected to visualize how much of the future was resting on his decision to move, to go. His decision to follow God set into motion the development of the nation that God would eventually use as his own when he visited earth himself through Jesus. Through Abraham, the entire world was blessed. Abraham never saw that. He never even saw a fraction of what he was being called into, but he started that in motion because of his obedience. I'm going to give you, if you are taking notes, let me give you some scriptures so that if you're excited to go back and read about Abraham, let me just rattle off a few. So the key verse that refers to Abraham's calling is out of Genesis 15 verse 6, and it said, "And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord declared him righteous because of his faith." Abraham's story is told in Genesis chapter 11 all the way through to Genesis chapter 25. So there's 14 odd chapters where Abraham's life is referred to. And then there's other references. Exodus chapter 2 verse 24, Matthew 1 verse 1 and 2, Luke chapter 3 verse 34, Acts chapter 7 verse 2 to 8. Several sections in Romans chapter 4 are dedicated to speaking about Abraham. Galatians chapter 3, and then Hebrews chapter 11. I'm not sure. Sorry, I neglected to go back and check this. But Hebrews chapter 2, 6, 7, and 11. The whole chapters make reference to Abraham periodically. 2, 6, 7, and 11. So yes, there's a lot of substantiation and a lot of reference to Abraham and his obedience and his walk of faith. But let's just have a look at what some of his strengths and accomplishments were. So Jess, if you wouldn't mind putting up that first slide. And feel free, if you don't want to take notes, you're welcome to take photos of these. But so some of the strengths and accomplishments attributed to Abraham was his faith pleased God, and it speaks about that in Genesis chapter 15. He also became the founder of the Jewish nation. He was respected by others, and he was courageous in defending his family at any cost. And that's referred to in Genesis chapter 14, where kings that captured Abraham's goods and family, and then he went and defended that, and he defended his family. He was not only a caring father to his own family, but he practiced hospitality to others. In Genesis chapter 18, we read about the angels that came to actually destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. But just before that, they spoke to Abraham and Sarah, and that's when they promised that he would be having a son, and Sarah had laughed. You remember that story. But Abraham extended hospitality to those angels. And that was just the nature of his heart and what he wanted and what he did. Some really good character traits. He was a successful and wealthy rancher. He would have done well in Alberta. He would have been one of those guys that would have been aspiration to get to one of his ranches to go and see what he had. Speaks about that in Genesis chapter 13. And he usually avoided conflicts. But when they were unavoidable, he allowed his opponents to set the rules for settling the dispute. You might refer to Genesis chapter 13, where there's a dispute between Abraham and Lot, his nephew Lot, and the land that they needed to settle on, because the space just got a little too small for them and their herds. That just goes to show how wealthy they were and how many herds they had. But he settled it by saying to Lot, you choose where you want to go and I'll take what's left over. He didn't dictate and dominate and say, this is what is entitled to me, I'll take what's good and I'll leave you the leftovers. God blessed that. Okay, the next one we're going to go on to is these weaknesses and mistakes. And this is where it gets a little bit juicy, but it also starts getting a little close to home. Under direct pressure, he distorted the truth. This man of faith that God spoke of so highly and was referenced in how many scriptures that I referred to earlier on. Under direct pressure, he distorted the truth. When he was exposed to King Abimelech, and even the Pharaoh in Egypt, in Genesis chapter 12 and Genesis chapter 20, he identified Sarah as his sister instead of his wife because his life was threatened. So he lied. he didn't necessarily have the courage or the backbone. Hey, I'm not judging Abraham. I don't know that I would have had any more. Sorry, love. I'm not sure that I would have done anything any differently. But to try and preserve what God had promised me to get to that promised land. But this is one of the traits that stands out as him being a mere mortal, in spite of what God had spoken to him. And then lessons from his life is that God desires dependence, trust, and faith in him. It's not faith in our ability to please him that God's looking for. He's looking for our dependence, trust, and faith in him. And God's plan from the beginning has been to make himself known to all people. That was his intention through Abraham, and that's why he set Abraham's life in motion to then become the father of many nations, so that he could have a relationship with us all. I want to pose a question to you in the light of Abraham. And this is me speaking to myself. I had actually written this in the first person, but I've changed it back to the third person. We don't know the long-term effects of most of the decisions we make. But the fact that there are long-term results or consequences does or should cause us to think carefully and seek God's guidance as we make choices and take action today. I don't want to speak to your faults. I don't want to speak to where you think you've messed up. I don't want to speak to your incapabilities or even maybe your lack of capability to make decisions. I want to speak to what God has called you to be. The identity that is imposed on you, the identity that he's given you. And to know that that is what he's called you to do, not looking back at your past imperfections and failures. I don't want to highlight this as Abraham was a flawed man, but I do want to read these flaws and these learnings in the light of the man that is spoken about in Hebrews chapter 11 as a man of faith. And I want to encourage us. Are you encouraged? I hope you will be. Okay, we're going on to Isaac. The next generation. Things will have changed going on to the next generation because he would have learned from his dad's mistakes, right? Excellent. That's just true. But let's just give a little bit of a background about Isaac. So we don't have to put up the next slides yet, Jess. We'll move on to those a little later. But let's talk about Isaac's name. So a name carries great authority. It sets you apart. It triggers memories. The sound of it calls you to attention anyway. Krista! You respond straight away, right? It's not like someone on that side suddenly responds when I mention your name. Somebody else responds. But as soon as I mention Jack's name, even though I'm looking there, Jack wants to respond because he suddenly knows I'm probably referring to him. So your name definitely elicits a response. It triggers memories. When you hear a name, I can't think of any right now, and I'm not going to try and dig too deep, but I suspect that when you named your children, there were probably names that came up of people you knew and you thought, yeah, we're not going to call my child that because I had a bad experience in the past, right? Names are associated and they have really strong associations, and that's why when we have the privilege of dedicating our children publicly here in church, as Alex and Cara and John and Sonia did a few weeks ago, speaking out the names of their children and why they've chosen those names is so important because we recognize that names carry value and they carry importance. Many Bible names accomplished even more. They were often descriptions of one's past and hopes for the future. The choice of the name Isaac, which means he laughs or laughs, for Abraham and Sarah must have created a variety of feelings in them each time they heard his name spoken. At times it must have recalled their shocked laughter at God's announcement that they were going to be parents at both 90 and 100. Of course, that's going to initiate laughter. I mean, that's ridiculous if someone came and told you that. So I'm sure they were reminded of that day that they were told they were going to become parents, and when they heard Isaac's name, he laughs. They must have been reminded of that often. At other times, it must have brought back the joyful feelings of receiving their long-awaited answer to prayer, of receiving a child. So Isaac's name would have had numerous, would have elicited numerous responses to Abraham and Sarah. But most important, it was a testimony to God's power in making his promise a reality. There's some in this gathering. God spoke to you about a name of a child. And when that child came to pass, it spoke about the testimony of God's power, making a promise a reality. Let's hear a little bit about Isaac. In a family of forceful initiators, Abraham being one of them, and Isaac was quiet. He was a mind my own business type of guy, unless he was specifically called on to take action. So he had strong leadership qualities. He was the protected only child from the time Sarah got rid of Ishmael until Abraham arranged a marriage to Rebekah. In his own family, Isaac had the patriarchal position. He was the patriarch of his family. But Rebekah had the power. Go back and read the story. I tell you, it's actually a little unnerving reading these stories, thinking these are our forefathers and what they did. And I know that there's cultural differences, so thank the Lord for cultural differences. But sometimes we have to read these stories and wish that we understood the cultural differences a little bit more, because there was some weird stuff that went on in their generations and how they were determined to perpetuate and even grow their family or eradicate people ahead of them. But in this instance, Rebekah had the power. Rather than stand his ground, Isaac found it easier to compromise or lie to avoid confrontations. There's the lying thing comes up again. So it seems like the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. When we think of Abraham, not that he was a perpetual liar, but he did lie to preserve his circumstance and to survive, actually. Abraham had an encounter with King Abimelech. Funny enough, when you read about Isaac, he had an encounter with the same king, and he had to say that Rebekah was not his wife. Funny, eh? Same situation as his dad had gone through. And it initiated the same response of lying. I find that quite fascinating. And in spite of these shortcomings, though, Isaac was part of God's plan. The model his father gave him included a great gift of faith in the one true God. God's promise to create a great nation through which he would bless the world was passed on by Isaac. Isaac was part of that plan, and he passed that plan on to his two sons, Jacob and Esau, his twin sons. The key verse around Isaac is in Genesis chapter 17, verse 19, if you're taking notes, if you want to refer to that. And this, in the New Living Translation, says, "But God replied, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my everlasting covenant with him and his descendants." That's how specific it was. Gave him the name so that that's good enough to say. Isaac's story is also told, so here's a few references to Isaac's story. Genesis chapter 17, verse 15, all the way to chapter 35, verse 29. So chapter 17, verse 15 to Genesis 35 to 29. And then there's other references to Isaac in Romans chapter 9, verse 7 to 10. Another one in the New Testament, I read it earlier on in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 to 20. And then he's even referred to in James. The book of James refers to him in chapter 2, verse 21. You want to see what some of Isaac's strengths and weaknesses were? Let's see how different it is from Abraham's. He was the miracle son, born to 90-year-old Sarah and 100-year-old Abraham. He was the first descendant in fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, and he seems to have been a caring and consistent husband. That was apparently at least until his sons were born, and then something changed. I'm not sure how that happened. But in Genesis chapter 24, verse 67, it says, "He loved Rebekah very much, and she was a special comfort to him after the death of his mother." And he was very fond of Rebekah. But then when the twin sons kind of got going, and when life started taking over, and there was rivalry between the brothers, then something happened. I'll get to that in a second. He also demonstrated great patience in Genesis chapter 24. A servant, Abraham sent out a servant back to Laban, back to where Abraham had come from, to go and look for a wife for Isaac. And during that time, there was a long period of waiting. Isaac demonstrated great patience. So these were good strengths and accomplishments of Isaac. You want to take a look at some of his weaknesses and mistakes? Under pressure, he tended to lie. So here's the apple that we spoke about a little earlier on. Genesis chapter 26, where Isaac was also deceived by Abimelech. Just very similar to Abraham, where it happened in chapter 20. In conflict, he sought to avoid confrontation. And he played favorites between his sons. And in doing so, he alienated his wife, Rebekah. Not a great role model. Some of us may look at our own dads or even grandparents, and we see those alienations, those favoritisms, those unapologetic preferences for one over another, and that just unspoken, sometimes demeaning of one beneath another. Let's see what some of the lessons from Isaac's life were. Patience often brings rewards. He waited for Rebekah. Both God's plans and his promises are larger than people. God keeps his promises. He remains faithful, though we are faithless. I love that about this. It's not about Isaac and his capabilities, even about his heritage or his inheritance or where he'd been called from, but it's about God's faithfulness. Playing favorites is sure to bring family conflict. I think there have been one or more movies that have been filmed about family conflict because of preference, because of that favoritism. But then I also wanted to add one, and I'm not sure if it's up here. I think I added it afterwards, and this is Derek's interpretation. But the power of blessing. Isaac pronounced blessing over Jacob, where Isaac was supposed to have spoken blessing over Esau, but there was this whole perception thing that happened. So Rebekah, remember that she wasn't completely above board. She too had preference and favoritism. But the implications of that was that in his blind state, Isaac ended up blessing Jacob instead of Esau. And then Esau came and brought his meal that his father had asked him to bring, and he brought it into him, and Isaac said, "But I've already blessed you." And he said, no, but you must have blessed my brother. And he couldn't recant that word. He couldn't pull that back. I want to remind us just of the power of words. And again, just the blessings that we speak over children in this community when we dedicate them, but even when we speak about them. The words that we speak have life. They have death, and they have the ability to speak death too. I want to encourage us to be reminded and to try and be spoken of as being people who speak life. I hope this is an encouragement. Thank you. I hope this is an encouragement and not a heavy. That's not what it's supposed to be. But it is a little bit of a mirror up to us to say, I see some of these traits, and I wonder what that means. So here's a question or a comment. It is usually not hard to identify with Isaac in his weaknesses. So some of those things that have been put up on the screen, we can identify with them, and we do identify with them. But I want to ask you to consider for a moment that God works through people in spite of their shortcomings, and often through them. He speaks and works through our shortcomings. As you pray, maybe you'll take some time after this work just to go and pray through some of these things. Put into words your desire to be available to God. You will discover that His willingness to use you is even greater than your desire to be used. He will use you. If He's spoken and says that He will work through you, I don't believe that there's anything that can cause you to derail that plan. Other than that, I do want to make comment that Abraham had the option of staying where he was rather than going. And God would have had another plan, I suspect, but Abraham was his plan A. And the implications even worked through Isaac. So I want to ask you that in spite of Isaac's flaws, don't be looking at your own flaws and disqualifying yourself. Don't be looking at your past. In spite of those shortcomings, God will continue to work through them. Are you okay to move on to Jacob? Okay, and then we'll go on to Joseph and then the 12 sons of Jacob, but we'll quickly cover those 12 guys and then you can go home by 4 o'clock. Good. So this is now Jacob. Right, I am kidding, you know that. Right, thank you. Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are among the most significant people in the Old Testament. It's important to realize that their significance is not based on their personal characters, not on their personal characters, because you saw how flawed their characters were, but they're based on the character of God. Can I read that again? It's important to realize that their significance is not based on their personal characters, but upon the character of God. They were all men who earned the grudging respect and even the fear of their peers. They were wealthy and powerful, and yet each was capable of lying, deceit, and selfishness. They were not the perfect heroes we might expect. Instead, they were just like us, trying to please God, but often falling short. That's a comfort. It really is a comfort. But you know what? That doesn't absolve us of getting our lives sorted out. God's grace does extend to us. But God's grace also causes us to want to change and to become more Christ-like. And I think these men persevered, and even Sarah persevered to becoming more Christ-like. Jacob was the third link in God's plan to start a nation from Abraham. The successes of that plan was more often in spite of, rather than because of Jacob's life. Before Jacob was born, God promised that his plan would be worked out through Jacob and not through his twin brother Esau. So it was already outlined that Jacob would be the continuation of God's plan. Although Jacob's methods were not always respectable, and we'll show some of those on the coming slides, so be aware. Jacob was not flawless. Even though his methods were not always respectable, his skill, his determination, and his patience have to be admired. So we'll take a look at those now. But I want to speak, and I'm going to read a few of these, because when you do delve into and don't get caught up in the weeds of these Genesis stories and just the weird stuff that goes on in family dynamics and relationships, there are 4 stages of Jacob's life that this version of the Bible, this version of the study Bible highlights and that I wanted to speak to. And each one is marked by a personal encounter with God. So 4 stages that Jacob went through, and each of them is marked by an encounter with God. So here's the first one. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 19 to 34. If you're taking notes, None of this is going to be up on the screen. So Genesis 25, verse 19 to 34. Jacob lived up to his name, which means grasps the heel. Figuratively, it means the deceiver, or he deceives. He grabbed Esau's heel at birth, and by the time he fled from home, he had also grabbed his brother's birthright and his blessing. So he was a bit of a grabber. Talk about a name having a lot of meaning. During his flight, God first appeared to him. Not only did God confirm to Jacob his blessing, but he awakened in Jacob a personal knowledge of himself. When he was fleeing away from Esau, God met with him and spoke to him. And that was when he had his first encounter with God, in spite of being the deceiver, in spite of being the one who usurped and stole and grabbed. God then met with him. That was the first stage. Stage number 2 is in Genesis chapter 29. Here Jacob experienced life from another side, being manipulated and deceived. Oh, now suddenly the shoes on the other foot. This is quite an interesting switch. Jacob was manipulated and deceived by Laban. Do you remember he went and he fell in love with Rachel? He saw her from a distance, fell in love with her. He had also gone back to go and find a wife, where his ancestors had come from. And he met his great uncle, Laban. It happens to be the same Laban that's referred to in Isaac's story. And he saw Rachel, and he ended up having to work for 7 years to get married to her. And then there was a little bit of deception. And Laban pushed his less than attractive other daughter, Leah, in first. And he ended up marrying Leah through strange turn of events. And then he found out that he had married the wrong sister. And so he spoke to Laban about this devious plan that Laban had to get rid of his less than attractive daughter. And he had to work another 7 years for Rachel. But he had got Rachel in the meantime. He got her to year 7 and 1 week. And then had to work another 7 years. So he was a man of patience. But it was like, what you've been doing for your previous part of your life, stage 2, suddenly turns around. But there's a curious change during this phase. The Jacob from stage 1, where he was the deceiver and he was the grabber, he would have normally left Laban if he hadn't had this encounter with God that he had on the way, fleeing from Esau. The Jacob in this stage would have, from stage 1, would have left, but in this case he stayed. He was willing to stay. Something in his heart had changed because of that encounter with God. And he stayed on for many more years, waiting for God's permission. Then there's a stage 3. This is in Genesis chapter 32, verse 22 to 32. Are you loving all these scriptures this morning? I hope you go back and read Genesis. There's some really good stories about how these things interact. But I did find that it was really helpful to have this extracted for me. Otherwise, I'd have got caught up in the politics of what was going on in all of that part of Genesis. But there's a third stage that Jacob went through. And this was his new role as a grabber. But this time, at the Jordan River, he grabbed onto God. Remember, he fell asleep and he wrestled with the angel. And he grabbed and he said, I won't let you go until you bless me. And in the morning, his hip joint was put out. But in all of that, he ended up having a name change. This whole thing about names and the significance of names. And God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. What does Israel mean? He struggles. He struggles with God is the meaning of that. Stage 4, as we get ready to finish. Genesis chapter 45 is Jacob's last stage of life, when he was going to be grabbed by God. God achieved a firm hold on him. In responding, by Genesis chapter 45, he's lost Joseph. Joseph's gone off to Egypt. But that's all part of God's plan, to let them survive and to bring his brothers and eventually his dad back to Egypt, so that, because there was going to be famine in the land. I remember that story. But before Jacob just got up and went to go back to Egypt to go and see his son, who he thought was dead all these years, the maturity that had developed in him by this stage 4 was that he sought God first before he left. He was unwilling to leave Canaan, to go to Egypt until he had sought God. That was the maturity that had been developed in him. It's very encouraging to see that he had progressed and matured. The key verse about Jacob, if you want to make a note of this, Genesis chapter 28, verse 15. What's more, I will be with you, and I will protect you wherever you go. I will someday bring you safely back into this land. I will be with you constantly until I have finished giving you everything I have promised. What a spectacular promise to be given as a dad. Eh? Jacob's story is told in Genesis chapter 25, all the way through to Genesis chapter 50. And it's referenced, his name is referenced in Hosea, in Matthew, in Acts, in Romans, and in Hebrews. I won't go through all the details of the exact scriptures, but he's referenced throughout. What are some of his strengths and accomplishments? Jesse, do you want to put those up on the screen? He was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Fascinating story how it came to 12, seeing as that his wife Rachel only had one of those children, maybe one. But we don't ask the questions of how we got there. It's all part of God's plan, right? In this instance, even though their lives looked like a real schmoz in some instances, God still used. In spite of, God still used. He was third in the Abrahamic line of God's plan. He was determined. He was willing to work long and hard for what he wanted. He saw in Rachel what he wanted, and he pursued. And he was a good businessman. There's some very interesting stories about how he tricks his father-in-law Laban out of goats and he becomes a wealthy man. Fascinating. How that happens, eh? Cool stories, cool biblical stories, miracles. We could do with some of those fascinating miracles in our lives at the moment, right? What are some of his weaknesses and mistakes? Okay, let's have a look in the mirror. When faced with conflict, he relied on his own resources rather than going to God for help. Oh, that speaks of my life so often. When I'm faced with conflict, when I'm faced with pressure, when I'm faced with deadlines, when I'm running myself a little bit thin because time is short and hours are few, I so easily rely on my own capabilities. I just thank God that He's faithful. I thank Him that He's still in control. I do thank Him that I have a heritage where something has been grounded in my life that I can call on, and that some of it's second nature that I can just call on, know to wait on Him. But still, we make some ridiculous decisions when we're under pressure, and when we're under conflict, and when we're needing our own resources. He also tended to accumulate wealth for his own sake. Some of the lessons from his life is that security does not lie in the accumulation of goods, and all human intentions and actions, whether good or evil, are woven by God into His ongoing plan. What man intended for harm, God turns around for good. How often don't we hear of that story? But in the moment, and even in our lifetimes, we may not see that. But it is a multi-generational plan that God has. And I want to encourage us and exhort us that if we're not seeing the responses we're not seeing God work the way we think that He should be working now, it doesn't make it any easier, but believe Him that He does have a bigger plan and perspective than we do. Question at the end of Isaac's life. Can you think of times when God has made Himself known to you? Do you allow yourself to meet Him as you study His Word? What difference have these experiences made in your life? Are you more like the young Jacob, forcing God to track you down in the desert of your own plans and mistakes? Or are you more like the older Jacob, who presented his desires and plans before God for His approval before taking any action? Sobering question. Sometimes we don't know until hindsight, and we look back and we say, maybe I can really make a good consultation of God. But I just encourage us to put everything before Him and just let Him weave and work and do only what He does well. And sometimes we're not able to make decisions very well in isolation. It comes back to community. What has God called us to be? Who has He called us to walk in communion with? And I encourage us to not make those decisions alone. I am coming to land right now, but I have to tell you one final story that I heard on Friday night. It was a beautiful story. It's an illustration, and it's a real life story. I don't know the people involved, so I will talk about them as if that's just a story, but it is a real life story. A dad came home one evening after a long day's work, walks into his apartment, and it is a mess. The mom is busy baking with this dad's two sons, supposedly teaching them how to bake, but it is a mess, as only flour and baking ingredients tend to do, right? The dad walked in and he said, "This is not what I came home for. I'm leaving. You tidy up. I'm going to go and have a coffee somewhere else, and when I come back, it'll all be tidied up, I'm sure." This is how I interpreted the story, so I'm going to embellish a little bit, but this is how I picked it out in my mind. Dad comes back a little while later, walks into the house, and it's not much cleaner. It still looks like a war zone or something's gone off in the flour canister, bomb's gone off in the flour canister, but in the process, his two little boys come running up with their cookies that they baked. He says, "Dad, taste the cookie, have a cookie. So of course, being the obliging dad that he is, took a bite, and it was awful. How many of you have had to humor your kids? And so he put on a brave face and complimented them on their baking and culinary skills. And afterwards, he took his wife aside and he said, "I thought you were teaching them to bake. How could you let them bake such awful cookies?" And the wife was apparently pretty forthright. She wasn't one of those she might have been a little bit like, anyway, it doesn't matter. She spoke in a very forthright way back to the husband and said, "It was not about the baking of the cookies. I was teaching them to spend time with me." Comes back to the idea of, are we pursuing the heart of the Father heart of God, or the heart of the Godfather? And so these illustrations that I put up about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I know we laugh about their flaws, and it is a little bit embarrassing. I found myself squirming, thinking, oh my, these are some of my character traits. You don't see me behind closed doors. Only Krista does. She sees me in the recesses of my heart, and I really appreciate the prayers that she prays for me and how she encourages me. It's not to change me, but there's change that's needed. Sometimes we're diplomatic about our spouse's flaws, and sometimes we're a little less diplomatic, and our prayers of fervency increase. But actually, the bottom line, though, is that what does God see? And it really isn't the heart of the Godfather. If anything, God the Father is intensely personal, and it's not about the business. He couldn't care about the business of baking cookies and making them taste nice. But it is about us spending intimate time with Him, and Him wanting to spend intimate time with us. And out of that, for our lives to become lives that speak loudly of Him and of His goodness. So be encouraged today on Father's Day that our flaws as dads, our flaws as men, our flaws as spouses, our flaws as sons are not going to be held against us because of God's faithfulness and of His goodness. But we do need to be mindful of the legacy that we're leaving and the decisions we're making now and where we're tracking from and where we're going to. Don't do those in isolation. Call on the Father for that. Just in honouring and in our moment of honouring and honouring dads, I've asked Tyler and Joel. I want to honour Peter as the dad of this house, and Louis Else, just who we've